And we are back working on the ignition and fuel delivery systems on this 1999 Mitsubishi Montero Sport Limited. So we removed the entire intake manifold on the last episode, so if you're not there yet, I would recommend you go back and watch that video first. It can be a little bit of a bugger if you've never done it before. When I was recording this footage, I was working on both the fuel injectors and the spark plugs at the same time, but in this video, we are going to be focusing exclusively on the spark plugs, so you'll see me in this first step removing the fuel rail and the fuel injectors, but just know if you're only servicing the spark plugs, you do not need to do that. So you can start by removing the spark plug wires from the tubes, and this is what you don't want to see. My spark plug tubes are completely full of oil. It's amazing that this engine was even running. And this just tells me that my seals are bad and are leaking oil. And you can see here that was the case with all 6 cylinders. All of the tubes are completely saturated and the spark plugs are covered in oil as well. But don't worry, we're going to give this rig some of the TLC that the previous owner did not do. For some reason I didn't get any footage of this, but there are 6 10mm bolts around the outside of the valve cover, and those will need to be removed to get the valve cover off. Here is a view of the underside of the valve cover, since that last screenshot didn't give you a very good view of it. But once you have those 6 bolts out, you can go ahead and start gently working that valve cover off. And I say gently because this is really thin metal and it's really important to keep it nice and straight so that you don't leak oil in the future. So take your time and just gently work it off. Some are going to be stuck on depending on how long they've been there, but eventually it'll come off. And I was a terrible cameraman on this project because I don't have any footage of me removing the spark plugs either. What you're watching here is me reinstalling the new spark plugs, but in reverse. So basically, there's a 5/8 swivel socket that's specifically designed for spark plugs. So just stick that socket down in each spark plug tube with a ratchet and twist it out. The socket is magnetic, so it should grab onto that spark plug and pull it right out. The good news is that there is not really any engine sludge buildup. You can see there in the valve train, it's actually pretty clean considering the condition of the rest of the vehicle, so I'm hopeful that we can bring this engine back around. So back to the valve covers, this is the underside, and these rings that you see here are the seals that prevent the oil from going from the valve train into the spark plug tube, which they are failing to do, and you can see why here. They are supposed to be rubber, but these are absolutely solid as a rock. So those were a little bit difficult to get off, but it wasn't too bad. Where the real headache came was trying to get the valve cover gasket off. Under normal circumstances, you could get something thin or small underneath the gasket here and just kind of work it out. It may be stuck a little bit, but not too bad. But you can see here in this video that despite my best efforts, I was not able to succeed. I thought if I was able to get just a small portion out, then I could kind of run a flathead screwdriver under there and push the rest of the gasket out. But alas, the gasket was no longer gasketing and it had cemented itself in there. The only thing I could figure out that would work was to apply a heat gun to it. So after I had heated up the gasket, I was able to get under there and start chipping away at it. But you do have to be really careful when you're removing these gaskets because you do not want to bend that material around the edge. But after I got the gasket out, I decided to rebuild these puppies. I washed them, sanded them down, and then it was time to prime and paint them. And this is absolutely not a necessary step, but if you do decide to paint them, make sure that you tape off any holes. So I'll time-lapse this section for you, but I just added 2 coats of primer and 3 coats of black gloss, and that was it. Okay, and before we can reinstall these valve covers, we need to make sure that the mating surface is really clean. There's going to be a bunch of gunk and gasket material on there, so make sure that you get it all off. Don't use anything too abrasive or anything that could cut into the metal, because then that would make a channel for the oil to leak. So what you're seeing here is me trying to extract the small seal that sits at the bottom of the spark plug boot. There were a couple of spark plugs that I wasn't able to get out because, as you can see, that seal came off the end of the spark plug boot. So I just had to get a flathead screwdriver that was long enough to reach down to the bottom, and these had kind of sealed themselves to the wall of the spark plug tube. So I just worked the screwdriver around the outside until it was broken loose and then scraped it out, and then I was able to extract those last couple of spark plugs. It was difficult to get some of them out because of how much oil there was in there, and it was preventing the magnet from really grabbing onto the spark plugs. But eventually we got all of them out. Okay, now for the reinstallation. These are the new spark plug tube seals, and I'm just going to run some clean motor oil across each one of these before I reinstall them. And here are the new spark plugs, and I also picked up some of this spark plug boot protector. It's basically just like an anti-seize gel that you rub across the top of the spark plug here before you install it, and that'll keep those boots from getting stuck in the future. That is, as long as you change the spark plugs more than every 10 years. So these are threads that you definitely do not want to mess up, and you don't want to cross thread these spark plugs because then they could potentially blow out while you're driving. So I always like to start them by hand to make sure that they're seated correctly, and then once they're going, you can go ahead and put your ratchet on it and torque them down. And as far as a torque spec goes on these, I don't have a Montero Sport service manual, so I don't know exactly. From what I read online, it's between like 20 and 25 foot-pounds. But I just go until it's seated and then give it another quarter turn. You don't have to torque these down too much, and you don't want to shatter that spark plug in there, so just follow your heart. But after you snug down those spark plugs, just go ahead and run some more oil across the mating surface of those spark plug tube seals, and now we're going to move on to the valve cover gasket. I feel like there's a lot of controversy around using RTV and not. The reason why I decided to use it in this circumstance is because these valve covers are pretty beat up. I know they're not perfectly straight anymore. So one, I feel like it'll give me a little bit more sealing power, and two, I like it because it holds the gasket in place as I reinstall this valve cover inverted from the way that it is now, and it'll keep that gasket nice and secure. But I guess the word of warning that I would give to those that decide to go this route with the RTV is don't put a huge amount, a large bead in that channel. If it starts to squeeze out and it makes its way through the valve train and down into the engine, it could cause some major buildup and damage. So just a small amount to hold it in there, and I think you should be golden. I originally got the Fel-Pro gaskets, but they didn't quite fit the valve covers, so I took it back and got another Fel-Pro one, but they seemed to be the right shape, just a little bit too big and didn't quite fit, so I went with that Mali brand, and it worked great. Okay, now when you have the valve cover seated properly and the bolts back in, it's really important that you don't over torque these. I feel like this is where a lot of people go wrong, where they think the tighter the better. If it's tighter, then it's not going to leak, but you have to remember that this valve cover material is very, very thin, and it's really easy to make it warp. Again, I don't have a service manual for Montero Sport, so I don't know the exact torque spec, but I would say like 8 to 10 foot-pounds at the most. But if any of you know the exact torque spec and you want to put it in the comments section below, that would be very helpful. Also, if you can direct me to where I can find a service manual, I am having a hard time locating one. But from here on out, it's pretty straightforward. You just want to make sure that those gaskets stay nice and straight, that they don't get twisted or folded or anything as you're reinstalling it. If you did use RTV, that will help a little bit. But just get those snug down, and we'll move on to the next step. We're nearing the end here. We're gonna install our new spark plug wires and boots. I like this NGK brand that I went with. It has each one of the wires labeled on the wire with the cylinder that it goes to. I put up on the screen there which cylinder is which, so you know which numbers we're working with. I'll also put up a diagram here in a little bit, but just match up the correct number with the correct cylinder, and we'll be good to go. And all the wires in this set are cut to the proper length, with the longer wires going in the back and the shorter ones going in the front, so everything should match up perfectly. Now, if you were just servicing the spark plugs, you would reinstall the intake manifold because that's where the ignition coils are, and then you could match up your spark plug wires at that point. But since we're going to continue on the fuel injectors, I'm not reinstalling the manifold right now, but you can see here on the screen that each one of the ignition coils lines up there on the manifold with each one of the cylinders that's associated with the spark plug wire. So just line those up properly and you should be good to go. But if you're like me and you're going to continue on with addressing the fuel injectors and the fuel rail, then stay tuned for the next episode, and we'll be cleaning those fuel injectors, replacing the seals, and seeing if any of the injectors need to be replaced as well. So until next time, this is Project Montero.